going to start recording this session. So again, for those of you logging on, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and using the chat just to let all of us know what organization you are joining us from and your role within that organization. Awesome, thank you. And you can go ahead and do that in the chat. And I am going to, it's only 4:01, so I'm going to give people some more time to log in before I get us started. Awesome, welcome, Izzy. And for those of you just logging in, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and just plugging into your or into the chat the organization you are joining us from and your role. Awesome. Thanks for that information, Izzy. Welcome, Heather. I've done a couple PDs for the guardian ad litem teams through Pierce County. Awesome, welcome. And I'll give us just another minute or so and then I'll get us started. And for those of you just logging on, if you would like to go ahead and plug into the chat your where you're joining us from today, what your organization is, and your role. Welcome, welcome. All right, I'm going to get us started in another minute or so. Letting some more people in now. All right. All right, well, welcome to today's session, everybody. My name is Tovah Denaro, and I am an education consultant. I work all across Washington State. I do support school districts, community-based organizations, mental health organizations, really supporting multi-tiered systems of support. So I do a lot of work with behavioral needs and social emotional needs of students, as well as supporting and doing a lot of professional development around gender expansive youth and the gender expansive youth population. So that is what you are all here for today. We are really going to be talking about what does it look like to support gender diverse and gender expansive youth within the different systems that we have. I have broken up today's session so that we do have a couple opportunities for questions where I've put it into the agenda, but please feel free at any time to plug in a question in the chat. I will be using the chat today to do some engagement within this group. And this is what our agenda is going to look like today. We're going to go over some terminology. We're also going to look at the different laws that are in place that are protecting youth in school. I know I have a large population of individuals here today that are working within the court system and guardian ad litems. And so I also have a lot of information today about the child welfare system and where we can show up and support our gender expansive youth within the child welfare system as well. We'll go over the most recent data that just came out in this past January 2022, which goes into the previous year, so 2021, really looking at the LGBTQ data from that previous year. We'll identify inclusive practices that we can be participating in. I have a list of books as well as resources and some things of what to avoid when we are working with and supporting gender expansive youth. So today we're going to be analyzing data from the most recent research on gender expansive youth in our country to really gain an understanding of the unique experiences and challenges within the community. We're also going to gain an understanding of what trauma-informed and trauma-responsive supports look like, and applying those specific interventions so that we are increasing inclusivity within the school system, within the legal systems, within all of the systems that our youth are participating in. So we're going to start using the chat right now, and we're going to start with this first question. But what types of challenges do you see LGBTQIA plus youth facing right now? What are some challenges that you have either heard of, you have firsthand experience with for our gender diverse youth population? Absolutely, yeah. Harmful legislation around the country. This is happening more and more over the last couple of years that we've been seeing. We have a big bill right now in Texas, in Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill that's been getting a lot of publicity. But we also have smaller bills that are just as harmful coming out in Idaho and Nebraska as well. Yeah, family and friends, right, not supporting, lots of family discord, misunderstanding of proper gender pronouns. Absolutely. We're going to talk a lot about pronouns today. Bullying, for sure. Yeah, getting clinicians to write letters of support for gender-affirming care. I will just give you a heads up. You all will have access to my email today at the end of today's session, and I'm happy to help with clinicians and happy to give you, point you in the right direction. And then what about for you all in this session today? What experience do you have supporting LGBTQ plus youth? What has that looked like, whether that's in your current role or if that's just in your personal world? What type of experience? Yep. Yeah, when we have kiddos in our life that use non-traditional pronouns such as they, them. Yeah, absolutely. Supporting their desire to find peers and support for them to depend on. That looks different when we are gender expansive, when we realize that we are part of a marginalized group within the society. Absolutely. Yeah, time and opportunity to talk through needs and barriers at school as well as at home. Right? Advocacy begins with active listening. right? Hearing what our youth are going through, hearing their experiences, the barriers that they are facing. Yeah, advocating and supporting appropriate changes. Definitely within the healthcare system and charting to reflect pronouns. Yes, I hear this a lot from parents when I work with them across school districts all over Washington state. Just the need for the healthcare as well as the school system to make sure that notes are reflecting pronouns as well as names. Yeah, providing substance use treatment. Absolutely. We see within the gender diverse community a huge amount of youth that self-medicate. Yeah, feelings of validation. Right? It's so powerful when we affirm our youth just by identifying who they are. Yeah, that's challenging, trying to get other family members to accept LGBTQ plus children in the family. Absolutely. It's great that we already have so much experience in this session today, and please, by all means, during today's session, if there's something else that you want to interject and share out, please do so. So we're going to do a quick dive into terminology. Terminology is really important to get to understand the gender expansive and gender diverse population, especially when we're talking about youth, because a lot of terminology, a lot of language is changing. So we're going to talk about this idea of the gender spectrum, right? Really moving beyond the concepts that so many of us have grown up with of this binary, right? We only have two boxes, the male box and the female box. And we know that all of, especially the youth generation right now, are completely reteaching us as the adults so that we are relearning about moving beyond these binary boxes and that gender truly is a spectrum. It's not just these two binary male-female boxes that we have become so used to knowing. And so I also want to point out that there are a lot of letters to the initialism of LGBTQIA+, right? This term started as LGB in 1980, or in the 1980s, and it didn't really start in the early 90s. They added the T on within the community, and then throughout the last many years, we have a handful of additional letters and initials that continue to be added on, and really it's just a means of precision. And it's a spirit of inclusion. So today during this session, I do not have the time to go through every single initial within this alphabet soup, but I do encourage you to do your own research. If you hear something today that I say, please feel free to ask in the chat. And you all will have access to the slide deck today. So you can, of course, look at these terms, the concepts, and the different definitions that are part of this LGBTQIA+ alphabet soup. But a main word that we are going to be talking about today is transgender. And this is an encompassing term of many different gender identities of those who do not identify or exclusively identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So the term transgender is not indicative of gender expression, of sexual orientation, of hormonal makeup inside of our body, or of physical anatomy. It's specifically how I am perceived and perceive myself within my daily life, right? And so transgender is the term that we use, or trans. We do not use the term transgendered. And I always like to put that there because we know that trans individuals are people. They're not verbs. And so we don't want to verb the word. So the word is transgender. And we know that pronouns have been coming up a lot within our day-to-day life now and over the last couple of years, more so than ever before. So it's really important to talk about and acknowledge that some individuals use non-traditional pronouns. And when I say that, I mean, right, gender-neutral pronouns. We know that we have these gender binary pronouns, where like such as she, her, he, him. But we also have gender neutral pronouns. They and them is really common now. We've been hearing that more and more. And back in 2019, they was actually the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary Word of the Year for being used to refer to one person whose gender identity is non-binary. We also know that there are other gender-neutral pronouns that youth and individuals are using. We have ze, their, theirs, right? That's another common one. We have some pronouns that even I'm unfamiliar with, and I have youth introduce me with new pronouns that I get used to as well. It's also important to note that some individuals use more than one set of pronouns. Some individuals might use she, they pronouns, which means that in conversation, we would just interchange with the different pronouns. And some individuals we might be introduced to originally using one set of pronouns, and now we know them and they are using and choosing a different set of pronouns, and that's okay too, right? Pronouns are really about respecting the individual when they aren't around. How are we talking about the individual when they are not in the room? And making sure that we are practicing using gender neutral pronouns so that it becomes easier for us if that is not something that is typical in our vocabulary right now. When we think about legal documents, healthcare documents, school documents, we want to be really specific about what our support looks like around name and pronouns. So on legal documents, if you need to use the youth's birth name rather than their chosen name, ensure that the chosen name is still listed in parentheses. And a couple of things that you might hear me using today that might be new to you as well. I use the term chosen pronouns and chosen name. That is more appropriate. It's more polite, more sensitive than using the term preferred, because preferred means that there is still, that I would still have a choice. If your preferred pronouns are she, her, that I could still choose to use other pronouns, for example. So making sure that somewhere on the document, the chosen name and chosen pronouns are still being used. If there's an individual in the meeting that's using the incorrect pronouns or names, just correct them, right? Make sure that everybody is on the same page about the pronouns and names that we're using. I know within court meetings sometimes where a youth, for example, has been living with a foster family and the birth parents aren't as involved, the youth might be, the birth parents might not know about the change of chosen name and pronouns. And so you always want to make sure that you ask the youth if they want everybody in the room to know the pronouns that they're currently using and the name that they're currently using. So it's always totally appropriate to ask the youth if you essentially, if they want you to essentially out their chosen name and pronouns to others. Sometimes I've been in meetings with youth where they still want me to use the chosen name and pronouns, but they're comfortable if birth parents are using the name given to them at birth, right? And so we just want to see where the youth is at. And like you see here, try to use the term chosen pronouns or just use the term pronouns, right? My name is Tovah. I use she, her pronouns, right? And just avoid using that term preferred pronoun. And something else as a tip, and this is something that I've been seeing a lot of in court documents as well as in medical documents. When we are using they, them pronouns, we still want to make sure that we are writing in a grammatically correct way, right? Or while discussing the individual. And what I mean is just because we're using they to talk about a singular person, we're still using the term are. So this is, and I use my partner, for example, here. This is H. Denaro. They're the clinical social worker at Marybridge Gender Health Clinic, right? And so an example of what not to do is if I was introducing them and I would say, this is H. Denaro, they is the clinical social worker. I know that sounds weird coming out of my mouth, but I have seen it time and time again on legal documents where grammatically it's incorrect because because we're still writing as a singular individual. So make sure that we are being grammatically correct within documents. Any questions so far? And again, please feel free as I am talking to ask or type any questions in the chat. You can always private message the questions as well. So I want to talk about gender identity because gender identity truly is self-identified, contrary to what society is teaching us or what society tells us. As children by the age of 2, we become conscious of the physical differences between boys and girls, right? This is physical body parts, essentially. What do boys look like? What do girls look like? What do boys have? What do girls have? By age 3, most children can easily label themselves as either a boy or a girl. This is also the time that we become conscious of societal roles. And I want to be really clear, when we are in utero, right, before a child is even born, we start putting societal roles on them, right? This often starts with what we call in our society, a gender reveal party, right? And we pop a balloon and it's either going to be one color or the other. And based on that color, we determine what our kids' style is going to look like. Hair, clothes, nursery, bedroom, books they're going to read, right? All of these are part of our subconscious and determining whether or not we are boy or girl in these binary boxes, and then determining, are we identifying what is our gender identity? Because by the age of 4, without societal roles, children have a very stable sense of their gender identity. Now, the majority of youth that we see come to the gender clinic and having challenges with their own gender identity or having gender dysphoria is usually around the age of 11 to 12 years old. And that's because of puberty, right? When puberty kicks in, our body starts to change. Youth who are experiencing gender dysphoria might experience crisis. It's very triggering. And so they come into a gender clinic to determine, what do? I need help. But by the age of 4, most children are going to have a stable sense of their gender identity. If they want what they want to play with, right? What clothes they want to wear, what hairstyle they want to have. So we're going to do a little activity again in the chat. And I want us to think about, again, in terms of our society, when we think about the male gender, what do we inherently learn? And what do we teach as being male in our society? And go ahead and put that in the chat. And I'll just give an example, right? We know in our society, we teach blue is the boy color, right? Blue is for males, for men. Yeah, we teach independence, strength, being strong, yes. Short hair, absolutely. Strong, emotionless. Yeah, boys don't cry. Yeah, no emotions, no crying. Yes. We learn from a very early age that boys are soft if they cry. Yes, trucks and guns as toys. Boys don't wear dresses. Boys are the breadwinner. Absolutely, right? And this is not, I'm not saying anything in terms of this is all wrong that we're teaching this. I'm saying that generation after generation after generation, we have inherently learned this in our society. Right? This past week, I have spent, boys take care of the girls, keep them safe. Absolutely. Boys aren't in touch with their feelings. Yeah. I spent the past week with my sister and my brother-in-law and my two nephews. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old nephew. And those two could not be more different from each other. And the 9-year-old is very sensitive. He's very emotional. He's very particular. And he cries a lot when he doesn't get his way, essentially. And over and over and over again, right, I heard my brother-in-law saying, be strong, right? Pick yourself up. Don't cry over this. Why are you crying? Your 6-year-old brother shouldn't make you cry. You should be making him cry, right? Saying this repeatedly all weekend long. Yeah, rougher it with sports. Absolutely. Now let's move into the female box, right? Based on our society, the society that we are raised in, what do we inherently learn and teach that is female in our society? Right? The caregiver, absolutely. Responsible. Yes, demure, fashion, makeup, body image, totally. Yes, females are the nurturers. Females are the homemakers. We're the artsy ones. Yes, we have soft voices. We want to play with dolls. We want to do house play. Yes, submissive, emotional, allowed to wear dresses, paint our nails. Exactly, right? All of these are things that we inherently learn just from the moment that our parents have a gender reveal party and determine whether or not we are boy or girl, right? This is what we immediately are born into. Yeah, girls don't climb trees, right? All of these things. Yes, absolutely. Or if we do present more masculine, if we do present we don't want to wear dresses, we're labeled immediately as a tomboy, right? Yeah, not getting mad because it isn't ladylike. Yeah, over the past many, many years, I have had to work hard on not apologizing for things, right? Now, of course, I apologize for things when I really should apologize, but apologizing is a huge thing for females in our society. Yeah, absolutely, right? That boys are more competitive. We have to let them win. Yes, of course. So it's really important to recognize this because many of our youth that we work with may come out as gender expansive or gender diverse later in life. And that's not because they are confused, right? It's not because they want attention. It's truly because in our society, we have placed so many societal roles and expectations based on, it's not even their gender, it's their sex. Because we cannot identify somebody's gender. Gender is self-identified. We identify the sex of an individual, right, from the moment they are born, and sex identification is based on genitalia. So I always like to joke with my friends and family that we should be having genitalia reveal parties or genital reveal parties and not gender reveal parties. But so far, it has not caught on yet. Nobody wants to have a genital reveal party. And so a great way to explain this to somebody of any age, this is if you're working with young kiddos all the way up through adults, is by the gender unicorn. Oh, Gail, who reinforces which messages? You can, and feel free to unmute, or you can go ahead and type it in and I'll keep going and then respond to your question. So the gender unicorn is a great way for us to determine and identify the difference between gender identity, which is in between our brain, right? It's self-identified. Gender expression, this is how we express, more feminine, more masculine. Our sex assigned at birth, and again, I just want to reiterate that we don't want to call it gender assigned at birth because it's the sex, not the gender. And the 3 ways that individuals are assigned sex at birth is female, male, or intersex. Also who we are physically attracted to and then emotionally attracted to, right? And that's in between our heart. And so the gender unicorn is a great way for anybody to really look at what is my gender identity on this spectrum, my gender expression on the spectrum, who I'm physically, who I'm emotionally attracted to, and then my sex assigned at birth. And looking at where some of these might interlap and overlap, and really starting to understand that everything is such a spectrum, right? It's not common that an individual is going to be 100% on one side or 100% on one side. Oops, I'm going backwards. My apologies. All right. So before I move into the law at school, are there any questions about gender identity with gender expression? Any terminology that I've gone over so far? Yeah, absolutely. Intersex. Okay, yeah, so intersex, about 1.7 or so percent of the world's population are assigned intersex at birth. And that means literally that when a child is born, their genitalia is ambiguous. We are not able to determine whether or not the sex of the child is female or male. And so a doctor would identify the child as intersex. This, I will say, the inappropriate term for this that was once used a long time ago was hermaphrodite. We do not use that term anymore. It's an inappropriate term and an offensive term. We use the term intersex. And I will also say, so the only way that we can assign a child intersex at birth is, again, based on ambiguous genitalia. But there are other ways an individual can be intersex based on hormones, right? And so that might come later. So sometimes we'll have a youth come into the endocrinology clinic because they are 17 years old. They were assigned female or assigned female at birth for their sex assigned at birth and have not gotten their period yet. And so the family is trying to figure out, why has my daughter not gotten her period yet? And it turns out that she also has testes that never dropped, right? Or some hormones that are more masculine presenting, or like a lot of testosterone in the body. All right, so we're going to move into knowing the laws at school, because in the United States, transgender and LGBTQ youth do have a lot of protections within schools that many family members don't actually know about. And so I will, I'll make sure that you have all of the information today, and I've created a one-pager to help as well. But transgender youth are protected under Title IX. Title IX is most known for allowing girls in sports to play in sports and to get money for sports. It's really a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program, so not privately funded. Title IX sex discrimination extends to claims of discrimination based on gender identity, which includes transgender youth, as well as any type of failure to conform to stereotypical notions of masculinity or femininity. And that means that sometimes school districts can be brought to court over dress codes, right? Over how they're treating boys and girls, how they're treating their youth based on clothing that they're allowed to wear. So it goes beyond just discrimination based on gender identity to gender expression as well. In Washington state in particular, over a decade ago, school districts were required to adopt the state policy and procedure that prohibits bullying on sexual orientation and gender expression. So Washington state, for over a decade, has had a policy to ensure that youth were not being harassed, intimidated, or bullied based on their sexual orientation or their gender expression and identity. Back in 2017, Rakedahl pushed it even further and created even more laws to protect transgender students from discrimination. And Rakedahl at this time actually called out that it includes names and pronouns, includes dress code, participation in sports, the use of restrooms and locker rooms, right? So for about 5 years now, we have had a very concrete law for all school districts requiring that students that identify as transgender or gender expansive be protected. And of course, we do have the civil rights law, right, in Washington State Public Schools. The HRC, the Washington Human Rights Commission, has gotten involved a couple times within Washington State school districts when youth have felt like they have not been protected within the school system. And I'll give some examples of what this has looked like when a teacher has refused to use a chosen name and chosen pronouns, when a school does not have does not let the student use a bathroom of their choice or does not have a gender neutral bathroom. Students who have fought against having only a prom king and a prom queen, right, within their senior prom, right? So there's been a handful of times that the HRC has had to step in to support gender expansive kids and kids within the LGBTQ umbrella. And I also want to be really clear that the office of the OSPI office specifically has gender identity within their standards, within their learning standards for kindergarten all the way up through 5th grade and beyond. But it starts in elementary school, right? In kindergarten, starting to understand that there are many ways to express gender. How do we teach our 5- and 6-year-olds that? In 2nd grade, understanding that there is a range of gender roles. How do we teach respect regarding gender expression? Right? And then moving into the 4th grade, defining sexual orientation. In the 5th grade, identifying trusted adults to ask questions about gender identity and sexual orientation. Right? These are laid out in the learning standards within Washington State. And just 2 or 3 weeks ago, up north of Seattle in Mukilteo School District, a parent pushed back on a kindergarten teacher talking about gender expression within the classroom. Any questions about this? We're going to talk a little bit more about health classes and sex education within the school system. But it's really important to recognize that we want to and we should be starting to talk about gender identity and self-identity as young as 5 years old. There is one really good district and school transgender and gender diverse readiness survey that you will all have access to. This was created out of the University of Wisconsin, and it is extremely robust. And it's a great way to start thinking about within your system, how comprehensive and how ready are you to support gender expansive youth? All right, so we're going to move into a national survey on LGBTQ youth. This survey is put out every single year by the Trevor Project, and it surveys youth starting at the age of 14. And this past year, we had about 18,000 youth that participated. So To begin, I want us to recognize the suicide rate of LGBTQ youth. And what's really important as well, these rates are very alarming, and we can see where intersectionality plays such a big role with race, gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation. As you can see from this slide, 12% of white youth attempted suicide last year. That's compared to 31% of Native and Indigenous youth, 21% of Black youth, 21% of multiracial youth, 18% of Latinx youth, and 12% of Asian Pacific Islander youth. Right, so all of these numbers are quite alarming. And I want to point out that our Native and Indigenous youth population is the most at risk for a suicide attempt within the LGBTQ youth community. What we know is that affirming transgender and affirming non-binary youth by respecting their pronouns and allowing them to change names, change legal documents, is associated with lower rates of suicide attempts. We know this to be true. We know this to work to decrease suicide. It's also important to see that at the middle and high school level, very few youth are actually learning about LGBTQ people and LGBTQ issues. On the West Coast, it's only about 36%. So just having that visibility, representation, learning about the current important topics, the health topics that are going on, the legislation that is going on. Do our youth know what is at stake for them? And yes, you will have access to all of this material. So Margaret, that's a really good question. Kids are getting their information. They are going to social media for information. Kids nowadays are getting the majority of their information, whether it's correct or not, from TikTok and Instagram. Right? And yes, thank you, Kimberly, for pointing that out. It's very unnerving that is where the information is that they have access to. And I have two high school age boys that live with me. I have an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old. And some of the information that they share with me that they quote unquote know to be true, I literally laugh at because I think that they're joking. And most of the stuff, because if I'm honest, and if you have any high school age boys with you, you know it's, oh yay, I love Pizza Clutch. I hope that they come to your middle school next year. Anyway, back on what I was saying. High school age boys love to talk about sex and anything like sex related, right? It goes from like potty talk at the younger years to just like sex talk. I don't know if this has happened to other people, but it's definitely happening in my home right now. And you know, there's still a big difference between 18-year-old living at home and a 16-year-old living at home. And I will just tell you that some of the information that they have learned about anatomy, about body parts, about anything sex related, like I have to make sure my jaw doesn't drop because I'm so floored at what they're telling me because it's not true, right? And they're learning this from their friends that have learned it from TikTok or from Instagram, right? So it's important for them to get correct information, to get real information from adults, right? From people that they trust. And Pizza Clutch is a great example of where real knowledge can come from and some good trust within that group. 75% of LGBTQ youth reported that they had experienced discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity at least once in their lifetime. And more than half of them reported that they'd experienced this over the past year. Right, so just last year, more than half of LGBTQ youth reported that they'd experienced discrimination. It's important to identify and to talk about LGBTQ youth within the legal system. And I will tell you, I do a lot of work at Echo Glen, which is one of Washington State's maximum security for youth offenders within the state. And I am working with a handful of transgender and LGBTQ youth within the system right now at Echo Glen. But even more so, we see LGBTQ youth entering the foster care system, the child welfare system across the country, really. And a lot of this is because, right, over 30% of LGBTQ plus youth report suffering physical violence or experiencing physical violence at the hands of a family member after coming out. Almost a third of LGBTQ plus youth are forced to leave their families of origin as a result of conflicts with parents regarding their sexual orientation or gender identity. Between 20 to 40% of youth that are experiencing homelessness identify within the LGBTQ plus community. Right, so the gender diverse community, the queer community of youth make up about 9% of the youth population, 9 to 10% of the youth population, but make up about 20 to 40% of the youth living on the streets. In King County, there is one homeless youth shelter that is just dedicated for LGBTQ plus youth, because of the amount of youth experiencing homelessness within King County. And this is from another survey done of Voices of Youth Count, talking about housing instability among queer youth. And about, like I said, 28% have reported experiencing homelessness or housing instability. So they are more than double at risk of homelessness compared to non-queer youth. And again, you will have access to the slide deck, so you can use the link above. But here is a great a guide for foster parents that are supporting gender diverse youth. And again, just the overrepresentation. About 30% of youth in foster care identify within the LGBTQ community. And that's the most recent data that we have. We also know that LGBTQ youth are experiencing more symptoms of generalized anxiety, as well as major depressive disorder. 72% experiencing anxiety, 62% experiencing major depressive disorder. And then, of course, we have to consider COVID. COVID impacted all of us this year, right? All over the past couple of years. But 70% of LGBTQ youth stated that their mental health was poor most of the time or always during COVID. More than 80% stated that COVID-19 made their living situation worse. And nearly 40% of LGBTQ youth who had a job reported that they lost it during COVID. And the big challenge with that, of course, is that can mean that even more LGBTQ youth experienced homelessness because of job loss. Any questions about the data? I should say, or comments. And all of that data is accessible to you as well if you go onto the Trevor Project page or website. Yeah, so, and I'll talk about that, Margaret, because that definitely comes up a lot. And, you know, the truth is that less than 1% of the transgender population has, like, reverses their trans identity, less than 1%. And so I think what we're seeing right now, because what we are noticing is that there are more youth that are coming out and identifying as, I would say, gender expansive. So some kids identify as non-binary, which means that they're not really fitting into one box or the other. Other kids are identifying as transgender. And, you know, I think that with social media and with the more visibility and more representation, kids are realizing that they don't necessarily have to identify with what has been identified for them since birth, right? And so I think it's really important, and I to recognize that a lot of this has to do more with visibility. A lot of kids are coming out younger because they're seeing that it's okay to, or they're seeing people in the media that are also, you know, that identify as transgender. The other thing to remember when we're talking about kids, and I always like to say this, because even for us adults, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There is no medical intervention for transgender youth before puberty. The first medical intervention is what we call a puberty blocker. And this is not dangerous. It doesn't impact the growth or the hormones of the youth. It just pauses puberty. It truly gives youth a little bit more time to determine where they want to go from there in terms of like biology, right? So that's the first intervention. After puberty blockers, the next intervention, medically speaking, is when a kid is 15-ish, right? 14, 15, 16. And that's when we start to consider hormone replacement therapy. Now, hormone replacement therapy, there is testosterone, right? And then there's estrogen. And so it's really critical for us as adults to recognize that when we are working with youth before puberty, the only thing that we are doing is affirming the name that the child wants, their expression, how they are presenting themselves, and their pronouns. And, you know, that's okay, right? It's hard to be a kid right now, especially with all of the things that we are seeing, right, in the media, with social media, the accessibility to everything. And so any parent that I work with, I always let them know if their kid is trying on a different pronoun and they're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, let them, right? Let them see, does that feel good to use a different pronoun? I've had many, many, many youth that I have worked with try different pronouns to see what feels good for them, what feels right. And that's just part of them figuring out their identity. Absolutely. The amount of abuse, the amount of harassment during COVID was real. And I will just tell you from my personal experience, right? It is April. I work with transgender youth all across Washington State. Since January of this year, January of 2022, I have had to attend 2 funerals of youth, a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, that completed suicide. And a lot of that was due to the lack of advocacy and the significant abuse that they were experiencing and harassment that they were experiencing. So it's really important to recognize the power that we have as adults in these children's life to support them. Any other questions? When we start to think about inclusivity, and these are truly ways that we can support LGBTQ youth in making them feel safe, making them feel included, making them feel empowered, it starts with the attention to our environment. What personal pictures do we have up? What types of decorations do we have up? Is there visibility? Is there representation? Do we see a variety of different families, a variety of different individuals? Right? When we have a child walk into our space, do they see themselves reflected in the space? We want to avoid assumptions. Gender expression, how a child presents themselves to us, does not equate to sexual orientation. It also does not relate to more maladaptive sexual behaviors. And we have to think about bathrooms and other gendered areas. Does your space have access to an all-gender restroom? Do kids know where to go for that? Ideally, there isn't a key. I still have, and I live in Tacoma, and some of the high schools that I work with in Tacoma, I still have parents tell me that their kids won't go to the bathroom because the only gender-neutral bathroom is the one in the nurse's office, and they'll be late to class if they go to it. So they just don't go all day. We have to have accessibility. We need to make sure that we are not only encouraging, but I would say enforcing respect for all individuals. Any child's identity should not be political. And I'm saying this because I have worked with a dozen youth this year that have moved to virtual schooling full time because of teachers and other adults in the school buildings that will not use their chosen name and chosen pronoun. And it's our responsibility as adults to make sure that we are being role models and we are teaching others why we use chosen names and pronouns and making sure that we are advocating for those youth. Youth should not have to leave a school system because the grown-ups in the system are uncomfortable. And we also want to make sure that we are including social emotional learning activities. We're fostering peer relationships, whether that's in a school building or in other settings. We're helping students develop empathy. This information, talking about pronouns, for example, that should not be something that we just do with LGBTQ youth. Every youth should know that we introduce ourselves with our name and our pronouns before anything else. Right? So students are getting to understand that this is part of the community. We're not singling people out. We want to make sure that we are focusing on student and families' individual strengths. A lot of times when families push back on their youth's identity, it's based out of fear. It's based on them wanting to protect their kid. So how can we build that strength and how can we build that relationship while teaching the family what support looks like for their child? How are we promoting problem-solving skills? How are we promoting coping skills? How are we respecting the youth's name, pronouns, and their expression? And part of that is sometimes we make a mistake and we just apologize and move on. That's it. It's not about us. And again, being a good role model to other people that we are working with, correcting other people. Margaret, can you expand on that a little bit?
I just knew of a family where one of the children identified as being, I'm not sure which, maybe transgender. And the parents were almost like excited about it, like, oh boy, we're going to be in all the parades and we're going to be in the front and come on. And that's not exactly what this kid wanted. He just, and the parents kind of used them to be the cool parents of this transgender kid, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it goes back to actively listening to the kid and really talking to the kid about how can we connect with your parents. They want to be supportive for you, and maybe they're doing it a little in a way that you don't need them to be, or in a way that you don't feel comfortable with that. And so really just getting that dialogue with the child, with the youth, because I totally, I think that some parents, they want to show their support and then it's kind of like all or nothing. And so they don't really know how to find that happy medium, but really just having that conversation and fostering that conversation between the parents and between the child. We want to make sure that all of the youth know of their safe spaces, right? Where can they go to seek support? There are probably going to be some staff members, whether you're in a school building or otherwise, where there's going to be adults that will not be a safe space for gender expansive kids. And so we want to make sure that we have a plan in place for if kids have to work with and engage with an adult that would not be considered safe. And what does that look like? And so that's really having the conversation with the child, with the kid, to determine where can they go, who do they have access to, and who are the adults that are trustworthy. And then again, having some type of student-led or student-organized club, right? Pizza Clatch is a great example of an awesome club, predominantly down in Thurston County right now, but I know they've been trying to move elsewhere into other counties. I'm a huge advocate of Pizza Clatch. We also have GSAs, right? Those are gender sexuality alliances or gay straight alliances. But schools are required to allow these clubs to occur. And this year alone, I have been supporting school districts in Washington with getting these clubs up and running. So I've provided the curriculum, the scope and sequence, and they are the only clubs in both of those school districts that have had to actually go to the board for approval. Right? For some reason, the chess club doesn't have to, but the GSA does. And so just being prepared that some school boards might push back, and making sure that you have the data and you have the student voice of why these student-led and student-organized clubs are so important and so necessary. We also want to consider in your space, whether that's a classroom, an office building, a community-based organization, what types of books do you have? And I have a variety of books I'm going to show you, but making sure that there are books with characters within the LGBTQIA community. right? Making sure that kids are seeing themselves within the books, within the artwork, within the posters, right? Making sure that they are having that representation. I just saw today, actually, something that, I'm gonna like butcher it, but it was a new study that came out on library books that said that for every main character in a children's book that is an animal, there's for all Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQ, and disability, individuals with disabilities, like it made up all of these marginalized groups with all the animals that are main characters. And so really talking about why don't we have some individuals that are part of historically marginalized groups being main characters now in books instead of animals being main characters in books, getting kids to see either themselves or just see representation of diversity within school books, within children's books. All right, so talking about health curriculum, right? Making sure that we have information that is relevant to the queer youth community. And I have a book that I'll talk to you about in a minute that I absolutely love when I'm working with gender diverse youth. We also want to make sure we are using inclusive language, right? And so instead of using language like boys and girls, using language like friends, y'all has gotten very popular. Also, when we are talking about family, right, using words like guardian instead of mother or father, right, so that we're also being inclusive of diverse families too. But a big one within schools especially is using language like boys and girls, right, using language like prom king and prom queen. These are terms we do not need to be using anymore. Right, using instead identifying youth based on their grade level. You can line individuals up based on who's wearing a t-shirt and who's wearing a long sleeve shirt. Except today I was at a middle school and I was referencing a kiddo who was in a black sweatshirt. And then I went into the classroom and I noticed that about 15 other kids were also in black sweatshirts. So I said, oh, that's not a good use, because nobody would know who I was talking about. But just making sure that we're using language that is gender neutral. And I talked about this, but being a good role model means ensuring all adults are also being correct with names and pronouns. Ensuring all adults are understanding how to avoid gendering youth. You might not do that, but I was in multiple kindergarten, first and second grade classes this year where teachers were asking kids to pick out the boy colored crayon and the girl colored crayon. And there's no such thing, but you know we all thought of what that color was, right? But breaking those patterns. Training each other, training staff, attending trainings like this, right? Making sure that we are participating to increase our understanding. Knowing where there is access to community-based providers that are experienced, working with transgender and gender expansive youth, right? If you go onto psychologytoday.com, I promise you most people are going to have a long list that includes that they have experience working with transgender individuals. It doesn't mean they actually do. They can just click it, right? The Mary Bridge Gender Clinic has a great resource page on their website that you can access that actually goes into some of these individuals. Oh, that's an awesome idea. Yep, that's great, Kimberly. Oops. And just remember, considering the impact of our language, this is painful for kids. Seniors in high school, the language of prom king and prom queen can be painful, right? It should just be called royalty if high schools are still doing that. Any questions so far before I go into book ideas? Yeah, so Carolyn, most medical software, right? So like Epic is the big one that's used in a lot of hospitals around here, for example. You have access to write the birth name, but then the child's chosen name, right? Or the individual's chosen name. It does not have to be a child. And so then they would be called back by the chosen name. And so that's just something that in the medical facility or medical setting that you are a part of, you would just need to make sure that they know what the chosen name is of the youth. I will also say, I've seen in some clinics, and I love this because pronouns are not part of, a medical document unless it's in the notes, and not every doctor reads the notes before going into the room. But one thing that I have seen done that's awesome is that the medical assistant will put a Post-it note on the door of the patient before the doctor walks in, and that door, and it'll say they, them, and it'll say the chosen name, for example, so that the doctor sees immediately, so that the doctor is not going through or sifting through the notes. Any other questions? That was a good one. Yeah, the other thing I will say about chosen names is that changing your name, changing your first name and last name if you're not getting married is a process. It's annoying. It's frustrating. It costs money. So many youth within the system will not be able to legally change their name until later on, right? Especially if you're under the age of 18. And so it's really important for medical settings, school settings, any type of healthcare setting, and court setting, welfare setting, that the paper documents list the chosen name and the pronouns that the child uses. So I'm going to go through, and I'm not going to go into detail about all of these because you have access to the slide deck. But for young readers, some of my favorite picture books when we are talking about transgender youth or just diverse families in general. So I'll just show you a couple of these. I love this one, especially if you work with families who are religious or who have a religious background. The Prince and Knight is really cute. And then some books for young adults. So this would be for if you work with tweens and teens. It's more chapter books. A lot of these are more geared, I would say the children's books, the children's picture books are more about gender identity and diverse families. The teens and tweens books are more about sexual orientation, which makes sense based on development. And then this is the body book I was talking about earlier that I absolutely love. It's called the Every Body Book. And it's one of the only, if not the only, gender inclusive book that teaches about puberty, about sex, books about body changes, completely gender inclusive. Right? So we're not talking about boys' bodies do this and girls' bodies do this. I love this book. I have purchased so many copies of this book that I think I should be like getting a kickback by now. Because anytime a friend of mine has a kid now, this is one of the things that I get for like the, the presents. Because it's such a great book for any child. Again, you do not have to be a gender diverse child to learn from this book. Like I said, I have a 16 and an 18-year-old that live with me, and I go through this book with them, right? And they are cisgender, which means that they identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. They are both cisgender boys, and they love this book too. Probably one of the reasons why a lot of our dinner conversations end up being about sex. And then the last thing that we are going to talk about are just a couple things to avoid when we are working with gender expansive youth. Now, some of these things might seem obvious to some of you, and I have them up here because I have heard all of them before, right? Some phrases. If a young child comes out and is questioning their gender identity, right? Asking things like, how can you be sure? Have you really thought about this? How do you know that this isn't a phase, right? When we are working with youth who are questioning their gender identity, it is okay if they're just simply questioning it at this moment, right? Nothing has to be done right now. So it's okay if they are maybe being influenced by social media right now to figure out who they are, right? I am turning 36 in June, and sometimes there are days where I still don't quite know who I am, right? So it is okay for our youth to also be trying to figure it out, right? Making comments like, it seems like life is going to be so hard, or I'm just worried about you because life will be so hard. Those comments just aren't helpful, because our youth who are starting to realize that they're a part of a marginalized group in the world are already going to know that life is going to be hard for them. We also want to be cautious of any type of criticism regarding how out they are. And what I mean by that is some youth are going to choose not to come out to their family. That's okay. It's on their timeline, not on our timeline. Some youth are going to feel safer using certain names, using chosen names and pronouns with you, and not feel safe doing that at home. And that's okay too. Some youth are going to want to be out to the whole world and shout it on the rooftops. And that's okay, right? We want to support them where they are at, not based on our comfort level, but based on where they want to and how they want to show up. And we want to avoid any type of stereotyping. This includes sexual activity, gender expression, and that they've told everyone. Because a lot of kids, coming out, whether that's based on sexual orientation or gender identity, is a continual process. Here is a list of so many really good resources for you all. At the bottom of this, I also put that gender unicorn. It's a black and white copy, so you can print them out and have access to them. And then I also wanted to share this information with you all because the Mary Bridge Gender Health Research Program is actually conducting its first ever research study. And it's called the Gender Empower Study, and it's for any youth between the ages of 14 and 24 who identify as gender expansive or transgender and have talked to some healthcare provider about gender affirming care. And so you will again have access to this slide deck. And so I'm going to make sure that if you work with youth or young adults between the ages of 14 and 24, please feel free to provide this to them. And thank you so much for participating, for being here today. I am going to right now go ahead and put on in the chat this slide deck for you. So you will have access to all of this information. It's uploading right now. All right, it is in the chat for you. Any other questions? Thank you. I'm gonna stop my screen share. Please feel free, you have my email. I will put it in here as well. But if you have any questions that I was not able to get to tonight or that I didn't answer within this presentation, please feel free to send me an email. I'm always really responsive on email. Good, thank you so much.